Welcome to the Story Talks Back. Almost everything that we remember, think about, or imagine is a story. Stories entertain us, inform us, and even define us. They have upsides, and they have downsides. This podcast explores the power of story in every aspect of our lives. I'm Dave Stanton. Thank you for joining us.
Paul Muldoon has been hailed by the Times Literary Supplement as the most significant English-language poet born since World War II. His 30-plus verse collections include Quoof, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Moy Sand and Gravel, Madoc, a Mystery, Horse Latitudes, and 2019's Frolic and Detour. He has also edited poetry anthologies, written opera libretti, and published a collection of his Oxford lectures titled The End of the Poem. For 10 years, beginning in 2007, he was the poetry editor of The New Yorker. Muldoon also has an abiding passion for rock music, collaborating with the late Warren Zevon and performing with his own band, Rogue Oliphant, whose latest album is Sadie and the Sadists. Since 1987, Muldoon has been a professor at Princeton University, where he teaches poetry and songwriting. His next collection of verse, Howdie-Skelp, will be published in November 2021. Well, it's great to have you, Paul, on the Story Talks Back. I really appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for asking me.
Thank you. So I want to sort of begin by thinking about stories in your past and how much stories and storytelling might have been, playing a role in your early years and your development. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I'm from Northern Ireland. And when I was a kid in the 1950s, before we had television, and we were, I think, the second house in the vicinity to have a television, there was a long tradition of what we call in Ireland céilíing. And the Irish word céile, le céile, means to get together. And céilíing is getting together often in a particular house that was known indeed as a céilí house. It's a house that was particularly open to the possibility of visitors coming round of an evening. And they would not necessarily come with a formal invitation. They would more often than not just drop round of an evening to the céilí house, and they amused themselves there by singing songs, of course, many of which actually they'd made up themselves. Where I was brought up, the local farmers, people growing apples, growing potatoes, wheat, whatever they might be doing, as it were, for a living, or a living of sorts. They also got involved in amateur dramatics, and they wrote songs and sang songs. And then, of course, they told stories. And the stories they told were, of wild and woolly events in the neighborhood, sightings of ghosts, strange doings, the matter, as it were, by which I mean the material of country storytelling.
And did you sort of grow up thinking of yourself as a storyteller?
I don't think I did, no. In fact, I'm sure I didn't. I thought of stories been told by by people who had stories to tell, and they tended to be grown-ups, as it were. But just as you mentioned it, I'm reminded of a very particular phenomenon. I was brought up as a Catholic, and on a Sunday morning, we had Mass, And I, as it happens, was an altar boy. I served mass with a few of my neighbors for the parish priest when he came in to say mass. And we would be waiting in the sacristy, ready to go on, as it were, in the wings of the theatre, which, of course, is what it was. You know, it was various things, but it was theatre, among other things. And as we were waiting to go on for the big show, there was one particular fellow, Pat Campbell, who was adept at um telling pictures. Now, what does that mean? What that means in this case is that he would have gone to the local picture house, i.e., movie theater, as
Mhm.
in the last picture show, and on the day before, Saturday afternoon, he might have seen a Western. It was an era when, every week saw at least two Westerns. Thank heavens one can still watch them, and I do. Um, but Pat Campbell would tell you, tell us the story, the plot of the Western. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, the hired hand, was plotting against the owner of the ranch or whatever it was. So the story of the film was told. But I don't think I ever thought of myself as a storyteller. And it was only gradually, I suppose, as I became interested in trying to write poems, that the idea of narrative, you know, came into play, and I became more aware of it. I don't know if I ever really sat uh, down and thought, here I am involved in narrative or storytelling,
Mm.
not in any conscious way. But when I'm forced to think about it, as now, it's narrative is a feature of so many art forms. It's a feature of music, and I don't mean necessarily song. I mean music, straight up music, as it were. It's a feature of much visual art. Painting, of
Sure.
course, has a narrative component, some
Mhm.
more than others. But if you've, in any form of the verbal arts, the written arts, I suppose basically when you've got one word following another, you're immediately involved in narrative. I
Mhm.
mean, there are those, I remember over the years, there have been poetic movements, for example, that have eschewed narrative. They've said, we have absolutely no interest in narrative. That's
Mhm.
not what we're into. We don't do that. We do something else. The problem is that, one might decide as a poet not to do something, which I think actually is a fatal error for any artist. It's a mistake to say, I'm not going to do that. And even if one's going says, I'm not going to be involved in narrative, narrative will have its eye and its ear on you, right? Narrative will visit you whether you want it to or not. So, the poem, which is the art form that I'm most interested in, appeals to various traditions. It's a visual art form as much as anything else, but it's certainly a storytelling art form. And there is indeed um, there is a phenomenon known as the sung short story, which refers to some poems. Of course, they're in the traditional sense, there were narrative poems, many of them epic, right? In terms of genres of poetry, there is such a thing as narrative poetry. Um, but as I say, most poems, even the briefest and the most imagistic, a little poem like W. Carlos Williams, "The Red Wheelbarrow." has a story attached to it. In
Hmm.
a Station of the Metro, the great imagistic poem by Ezra Pound about the Paris underground and the flowers, the petals on the wet black bough, there's a story there, right? So it's very hard to avoid storytelling. And indeed, I'm not sure why anyone would.
Well, I guess I was wondering whether, thinking of your poems as a story, if you were doing that as you were working on them, and whether that might be expanding or limiting in your mind if you were to think of them that way.
Oh, uh, expanding. I don't think of it. It's just intrinsic, I'd say, to the business of writing poems at all. As I say, it's very hard not to tell a story, right? Um, and one of the things about telling stories is that, and this is true of the poem also, not necessarily evidently so. One of the things that poems are by and large trying to do is to clarify something, and to dramatize something. You know, and both of those ideas are connected to narrative notions. Um, and I mean, and that goes back to the earliest forms of poetry in many cultures. Funnily enough, just last night I was looking idly at an anthology of ballads from the English tradition, and the ballad is devised so many fabulous methods of telling stories. One of them was to tell stories by direct speech, conversations between characters, between Lord Randall and his mother, for example. What got you for dinner, Lord Randall, my son? I got eels boiled in wine or something. It varies, I think, a little bit from version to version. So there's the direct conversation. And of course, it transpires. His mother realizes, and Lord Randall realizes in that great ballad, that he has been poisoned by his beloved, quote unquote, who has fed him a dish of eels, boiled eels with a touch of poison in them. So the I love the ballad tradition, and I love the tradition of the poem in which Robert Frost, one of my favorite poets, excels, which is the poem that involves a conversation between a couple of characters, and many of his great longer poems are built upon conversations.
Just your mentioning the ballads reminds me of your love of rock music and the fact that you are in a rock band, and you have worked with Warren Zevon, and um, I was just wondering, what about rock music, um, and the words of it, the atmosphere of it? Can you sort of define how that appeals to you creatively, or what that does for you?
Well, I mean, again, funnily enough, I try for my sins to teach, quote unquote, songwriting, in the tradition of teaching things that one, you know, I, you know, I know a little bit about it. That's all I would ever say about any of these activities. I don't know more than a little bit about poetry. The longer one does it, I've been doing it for 50 years, and more I realize I know nothing at all about it, really. One of the things about rock and roll music is that it's like much um, music, music involving lyrics. Um, it's very visual. It's a visual medium. And Eleanor Rigby,
Mhm.
Father Mackenzie. I went down to the river with Bruce Springsteen. You know, we're looking at this, we have a particular image, we're looking at that, and it's very often essentially, I mean, for want of a better term, it's a cinematic business.
Mhm.
And some of the great songwriters, really understand that and use that to great advantage. So, I attempt to do that myself a little bit,
What was it like for you to collaborate with Warren Zevon on that one album of his?
I'd been a fan of Warren Zevon for years, really since probably 79, 1979, 80, around about the time Excitable Boy came out. And, you're talking about images. Well, he came down to dinner in his Sunday best and he rubbed the pot roast all over his chest. He's just an excitable boy. He took in the 3 a.m. show at the Clark and he bit the usherette's leg in the dark. He's just an excitable boy. And so on and so forth. After 10 long years, they let him out of the home. And he built a cage from her bone, something along those lines. And very, I mean, absolutely in the ballad tradition, in fact, among other traditions that it appeals to. He dug up her grave and made a cage of her bones, is the line. And so I'd been a fan of Warren Zevon, and as such, of course, I'd written him a fan letter. I'm a big believer in the fan letter. I've written fan letters to people, all kinds of people, starting with Robin Hood, as played by Richard Green. Of course, there's a character about him. There's a whole slew of ballads. But Richard Green in the television series Robin Hood, I wrote to him asking him if he had any spare bows and arrows that he could possibly lend me. In any case, I wrote to Warren and not really expecting a response, just saying, that that I loved what he did, and Warren's even, as you know, I mean, he was a genius as far as I'm concerned, but he's not really recognized to the extent that he should be, even among people who know something about rock and roll. And partly because, in a strange way, he was his own worst enemy. And, he had various problems that um, inhibited his capacity really to have a decent career. But in any case, amazingly, I heard back from Warren. He called me up and he told me that he was doing a guest spot on the Saturday night no, it was the David Letterman show, where he stood in um, every so often as band leader, um, when Paul Thingamajigger went on leave. And so he was coming to New York anyway, and we arranged to meet and we had a chat and we walked around. And at one point, he said to me, "How would you like to write a song?" And, which of course was like hearing from God, really. I mean, yeah, I mean, in a strange way, that meant almost more to me than, if the various people I met over the years, the various famous poets I met over the years or almost met, if one of them had said to me, "How'd you like to write a poem?" I don't know if I'd have been quite as enthused as I was by the prospect of trying to write something with more. So anyway, he had a couple of ideas for songs. Um, one of them, he had the title for a song, which was "My Ride's Here," and that was a phrase that had come to him one night at a show somewhere where he'd heard of, I believe he'd heard an ambulance, outside the show. It was a very small venue, of course, alas. And he said, as an impromptu remark, he said, "My ride's here." So that was as much as he had. He had the title. So as it happens, I wrote a first verse for it and sent it to him. We sent it by email. It was still the days when, I think he mailed me a CD with a version of the first verse and then the rest of the song. And then we started finishing it. Or it took a while to write it, actually. And that's one of the things, of course, that I probably didn't quite understand, um, is that songwriting is a very difficult art form, which is not that poetry isn't, but you sort of think, well, songwriting must be easier than that. And indeed, we know many stories of songs that have come easily to people, have come to them in dreams, have come to them in certainly in broken sleep. Keith Richards and his great riff, or Paul McCartney with some version of Yesterday coming to him in a dream. And but more often than not, I think, alas, a lot of work goes into it, and all the work, as usual, goes into making it sound as if no work is much at all has gone into it.
Mm.
So, for me, trying to write a song, writing a song with Warren Zevon was like being apprenticed to, it's probably like, being apprenticed to a great painter or something, if one were a visual artist. I think of it as an apprenticeship, because he was a guy who really, insofar as anybody knows what they're doing, he really knew what he was doing.
It's funny because, I think a lot of people might assume that, what you're doing with words in your poetry is a lot more sophisticated than rock lyrics. But you obviously don't see it that way.
I don't at all. I don't. And there's a very, and there's a, and that sounds counterintuitive. It sounds weird. I mean, for various reasons. I mean, na 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 na. Yeah. So that's a very memorable song, and what does it mean? It's a lyric that means nothing. Ubla dee, ubla da. What does it mean? So, in other words, there are songs that are extremely effective, and one has no idea what they mean, if they mean anything at all, and they can be quite effective. But for those that, of course, there's a tradition of the nonsense poem too, but for those that stray into making sense, and particularly in this era where most poets are not all that exercised by the traditional forms of poetry, are not really interested for the most part in meter or rhyme these days, in the way that most poets were, say, 100 years ago, certainly 200 years ago. And most people can actually have a career probably as a poet, insofar as such a thing is imaginable, without knowing anything at all, without knowing what an anapest is or a dactyl. It's perfectly feasible, I guess. But when you get into the songwriting business, it's actually much stricter. When you've established a template for a verse and a particular rhythm for, let's say, 4 lines, a rhythm that's associated with a tune, with a melody, whatever. Um, it first of all, it almost certainly rhymes.
Mhm.
There are very, very few songs that don't rhyme. There's some that don't, but most do. So to be able to pull off rhyming and to be able to replicate the structure of a verse, um, verse one more or less has to be replicated in verse two, and that more or less in verse three. There may be some little variation in the what comes between two and three, often in songs with an A A structure, as many songs do. They have a they have a little respite there. They have the middle eight or the bridge. Something else is happening, often in a slightly different key. But they're basically very, very simple on one hand, and yet requiring, I'd say, um, a lot more expertise than one would imagine. You know, given the fact that actually many song lyrics are actually pretty negligible, or um, in some sense, the pressure per square inch, which is the term I use to describe some of the differences between a song lyric and a poem.
Mm.
The pressure per square inch is slightly lower than it might be in a poem. It's not to say that it's worse or better, only different.
Mm.
The big difference, of course, is that in a poem, the poem, this is not something I came up with. This is an idea that seems very valid and valuable to me. The poem brings its own music. It almost brings its own score. It tells you how to read it, how to
Mm.
perform it, right? It instructs you. Whereas paradoxically, a lyric is missing something.
Mm.
There's some component that's not there, that that's required to make it. The phrase I use is to make it what it most might be,
Mm.
right? So it's missing something. And in a strange way, another of the problems, the difficulties with writing song lyrics is that you almost have to figure in something being missing,
Mm.
right? Which is not something that comes easily to us
Mm.
as writers.
You mean
Uh,
leaving space for it in a way?
leaving space for it in a way, yeah. Allowing, I mean, it's kind of chicken and eggish, but, you know, the music is going to do something that the lyric by itself can't quite do. Otherwise, I don't know if there's a lot of point in doing it at all.
Right.
Mm.
It's funny because I also feel like in your own writing, there's to me, there's a clear rebelliousness against expectations within certain poems. I feel you're saying, I'm not going to go in the direction you expect me to, or I'm not going to follow, you know, the precise structure, or I'm going to defy your expectations, which to me feels very rock and roll in a way. Do you sense,
Well,
do you sense that's true?
that's a way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, that certainly is a way of putting it. I mean, I'd say I don't want to start into big generalizations or large statements about this and that, but I'd say, there's a rebellious aspect to most interesting art.
Mm.
Um, you know, um, there's an let's begin. Let's go back a bit. There's certainly an unexpected aspect to, I think, to really any interesting art.
Mm.
You think, wow, I would never have thought of that. I would never have thought of that. That's how I want to come out of a poem as the writer of a poem. I want to come out of it thinking, wow, yeah, that would never have occurred to me in a million years.
Mm.
I would never have thought I'd end up there, you know? And as far as I'm concerned, is what I'm doing as a writer. Again, I don't think about it, but if I think about it, what I'm doing is really trying not to get in the way of allowing it to do something quite interesting.
Uh-huh.
I work basically on the theory that if I think I try to leave myself out of it as much as possible, including even what I think is interesting or not. I mean, that must come into play in some way because, at one's testing whether or not something is provocative, say, against one's own, you know, experience of what provocation might look like. But uh, but you're right. I mean, interesting art is provocative. I think it's and rock and roll, though it may not always achieve that, has has got that ambition. That's one of its ambitions, as I understand it. I
Mhm.
mean, I mean, there are those who say rock and roll doesn't exist anymore. I'm not. I don't quite believe that, but um, so that's the spirit, I believe. You know, and it's certainly the spirit. I think it's the spirit of any interesting artist at all. I mean, there are various ways of describing it. Avant-gardism. I mean, I think any interesting poem is avant-garde in some way. It's like nothing you've quite seen before. It may be a little bit like something you've seen before, but I think ideally, let's put it like that, there's an element that you've not seen before. Otherwise, very simply, why bother? Why bother? We go to the movies.
I mean, just to be a poet in this society is an act of rebellion in a way, right?
Um, well, insofar as anyone might be paying attention, um, I wouldn't say I don't wouldn't think of it as a way of garnering a lot of attention. Um, you know, um, uh, alas, um, um, you know, alas, poetry is not read to the extent that it might be in our culture um, for various reasons. So, um, in the way that it was read in the culture I was describing at the very outset of our conversation.
Right.
I mean, when I was at the neighbors where I was brought up, they would have been able to recite a bit of Shakespeare. I mean, they're just quote unquote ordinary people, whatever that is. Um, you know, but they'd been to school for at least for a while, and when they were in school, they would have read a certain amount of poetry in the school. It was part of the curriculum in a way that it's not quite these days, and I think this is true in the U.S. too. Um, but even popular poets like Robert Service, who's a very popular poet in this country, but actually was an extremely popular poet um, in um, in Ireland also. And Dan McGrew, the cremation of Sam McGee. I mean, these were party pieces. These were poems that virtually anybody could get up and recite. And recitation was
Narrative,
sorry.
narratives.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, recitation was was an art form that many people um, were engaged in. You know.
And how much, as you're writing, does recitation play into your revision or your initial creation in terms of the sound of it?
By and large, I'd say quite a bit. I don't necessarily sound out the poems. I don't necessarily physically sound them out, but I suppose I test them on an ear of some kind, an inner ear. I tend to operate by instinct and intuition. I'm not in general someone who works with a notion of meter, for example. I don't generally do that at all. It's all kind of hunch by hunch. Um, and I mean, sometimes I realize when I stand up to read a poem for the first time, I wish that I'd actually had sounded it out before then and think, oh my God, that doesn't sound so good. But there's a mysterious aspect to that. That's people used to, I don't know if they still do, talk to the same extent about poets having ears. You'd say, well, Yeats had a fabulous ear, you know, and that has to do with some intuitive capacity. It's to present a line, not in an inherited form, not in a received metric necessarily, though sometimes they did. They did fall into those patterns, and you think, wow, having a great ear, and it's got to do with a natural ability and what used to be called a talent. I mean, these are concepts that are not much spoken of these days because we tend to think, and there's something to it, that anybody can do anything. And there's something to that. But, the other side of it is, you know, I would love to be a great guitar player. But the fact of the matter is, I can barely manage three chords and I'll never be any good at it. It's just a fact. I'm just no good at it. And I could, work at it forever and I'd still be no good at it. And that's because I don't have a talent for it. And other people have talents for it.
Do you find that your students at Princeton, do they have very different assumptions about creativity and writing uh, than you do coming into your courses?
Um, I don't know. I mean, it varies a little bit. I mean, one of the really interesting things, just to go back to what I was saying a moment ago, I do believe that it's not that one may not be able to teach guitar playing
Mhm.
or teach poetry writing or verse writing or teach biology or Russian, right? But there has to be something on the other side, some receptivity to begin with, and some to go back to that word talent. Now, one of the really interesting, and I believe that I myself, and I think many other teachers could get at least one poem out of anybody. There are ways of doing it,
Mhm.
but um, whether or not, of course, whether or not one will um, make a great guitarist or a great poet out of anyone, as including oneself,
Mhm.
is a whole other matter. But one of the things I really enjoy about Princeton, and I think this is true of other universities also, is that um, many of the students who are in my poetry classes are not um, what we would think of as conventional, as having taken a conventional route to poetry. Many of them, for example, are not English majors or even comparative literature majors. Many of them are, engineers um, or scientists of various hues, and and that's actually psychologists. They come from a vast range of um, majors, as it were. And yet each of them brings something. And I think essentially what it is a kind of openness.
Mm.
If you bring an openness to the possibility that you might write a poem, if you bring a sense of humility to the enterprise, then I think there's actually a chance you will. And often these non-traditional, if we may call them that, students have a freshness about them,
Mm.
um, because they sort of accept that they don't quite know what they're doing.
Mhm.
And that is a good thing
Mhm.
on balance in this activity.
Um, so thinking about, sort of the story of your own work, and your career as a writer, how your writing has developed to such a degree over the years. Do you
Mhm.
have any sense of it as a narrative in itself, and do you have any idea about where it's heading?
The answer to both those questions is no. I mean, funnily enough, I had occasion this morning to, someone asked me for a poem on a particular topic, doing an anthology, and I was looking at a poem that I wrote probably 50 years ago, probably in 1970. Um, and I was looking at it and I was thinking, it's actually it's not, it's okay. It's not bad at all. And, I'm, sometimes I think I might be better at some things than I was. But then there's plenty of evidence to suggest that I have not improved at all. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest, as is the case with most poets, that I've disimproved. So the idea that one gets better is not necessarily,
Hmm.
it does not necessarily obtain in this particular business, and that's to say poetry writing. In fact, I've talked about this a few times, unfortunately. Most poets disimprove as they continue. They often start out actually, 18, 19, 20, up to 30. Interesting things can happen. Yeah. After, the longer one does it, the more difficult it gets, I'd say,
Mm.
for various reasons. For various reasons, including that one doesn't want to be repeating oneself, even though one's doomed to repeat oneself.
Mm.
You know, um, there's just, you learn to write each poem, you write that poem, the next one, what stood you in good stead to write the first one is not necessarily even applicable to number two, right? It needs its own skill set from the poet to allow it into the world. And you don't really know what that skill set, let's call it a skill set, is until you're working on it. You don't know what you have to be able to do, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I often use the analogy of a piece of furniture. If you've made a table once, there's a good chance that you'll make at least as good a table next time. And you know what you need for it. You need a hammer, a saw, an adze, or whatever the word is, you know. uh, um, you know, but with the poem, you don't even know that it's a table you're making.
Mm.
You only discover what it is you're making as you're making it, and it might turn out to require a whole other set of tools.
Mm.
It might not need tools at all. It might not be even it might be something else.
Well, I loved Frolic and Detour, and I feel like as I'm reading it that you're almost surprising yourself, from line to line. I love that sense of it.
Well, I'm very glad. Thank you. So I very much appreciate your saying that. That means a lot to me, because um, you know that's the hope. That's the hope. You hope one hopes that one's going to be fresh. The poem is going to be fresh.
Mhm.
We don't want to be staying on the train one stop past the destination, as it were. But then you never know when you're done. I mean, there are instances of poets who've, started off strong, and then they've had a kind of weakish period, and then they come back roaring. Come back with extraordinary work at the ends of their lives. So it's hard to know even if one should pack it all in. You know, there's a desperate hope that maybe it'll get better.
I thought, Salonika in the Yale Review, that was such a fascinating poem. The way
Thank you so much
that
for
you kept
saying.
retelling it. It was like a story that you kept trying to retell and somehow bring different perspectives. I'm not sure what it was fascinating and beautiful, but
Thank you so much for saying that. That's a newish poem. It'll be in my next book, which is coming out in 2021, if we all see it. Um, but you know, yeah, that uses a form, funnily enough, that I'd never used before. The triale. With this particular form, I've kind of a number of them sort of packed in together, and it's a fascinating narrative tool. But anyway, and that's a poem. Yeah, that's a pretty scary poem, and it's based on something pretty scary that happened to me, just like witnessing a road accident, outside Thessalonica. Mm.
I mean, talk about cinematic. That certainly has cinematic qualities to it.
Well, you've made my day. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Paul. I really appreciate it, and appreciate you made the space for this discussion.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be part of your podcast. Thank you.
The Story Talks Back is produced and hosted by Dave Stanton. The music you're hearing now was written and performed by Christopher Daydream. The theme music at the beginning of our show is an excerpt from Play by Merlin Twelfhoven, performed by Kronos Quartet as part of their 50 for the Future series. Please subscribe to The Story Talks Back on Podbean and check us out on Instagram. See you next time.